Hello and welcome everyone to the Audio Product Development Alliance. I'm Roger Shalvey, and this is the APDA, your gateway to audio product development. The APDA is where we come to build relationships and build better audio products. I'd like to welcome in also Steve Willenberg from LinkPlay, Joel Martins from Audio Express, Steve Hutt, who is listening in from uh, Equity Sound. And from also today, we'll have presentations, but I'm going to pass this over to Steve now to introduce a little bit more about the APDA. Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Roger, and thank everyone for joining. As everyone knows, our group is focused on promoting methodologies, practices, and technologies involved in developing and bringing audio products to the marketplace. Our sole focus is on the audio ecosystem, and we're excited today to have Dave Lindberg talk a little bit about sourcing. So I'll hand it over to Dave.
Yeah,
All right. Thanks, Steve.
and
Uh,
welcome, Dave. Dave is one of our founding members as well for the APDA. Thanks.
right. Yes, very formal introductions.
He is
Yeah,
he is our supply chain guru or our maven. I don't know. Can I say
well,
maven?
sure. All right. So let's not hesitate and keep people waiting. Let's jump directly into a presentation that we've prepared on this first live stream. So yeah, so I'm Dave Lindberg. I'm based in Hong Kong and I've been in Asia for 16 years now. So hopefully I have some tips and pointers to help people as they shove off on their journey to develop an audio product and some of the different business models and different engagements and different cultural barriers, different things that we need to pay attention to. So yeah, we're going to provide some insights from somebody. So a little bit about background is I've been selling to the supply chains in Asia since 2008, and also more recently and dynamically because of COVID, also doing sourcing for people as well. So playing both sides of it. So I have a little bit of a unique perspective on how to engage with some of these companies. So I've done both the systems and components for most major audio OEMs, ODMs, anything from small headphone factories all the way up to Foxconn or those kind of mega companies, largely via some mobile phone projects. But at any rate, let's get into it. So one thing that's important in any kind of project is you got to have a plan. So I often see people rock up and they just like, hey, I want to build this. And, you know, unless you're a very good friend or something, nobody's really going to take you seriously unless you have a formalized plan for your project. Um, and you need to have a team. So are you, and what that team is can be dynamic. It could be you and then some consultants and partners and a factory, or it could be more you and some engineering and some of your own technical resources and development, and then a factory. It could be all different kinds of dynamics on that, but just establishing who the stakeholders are is important. And then finding your vendor or vendors. So this can be simple. A lot of people like to have what they call a turnkey solution. But perhaps if you're doing something very special, you might have to dig a little deeper to find perhaps some specialty component that you're trying to build a product or an ecosystem around, or a component is a better word than product on that. So finding who those sources are is important. And you want to be friendly, but not friends with all your factories. You need to make sure that you don't just pick one vendor and say that's who I'm working with. You need to make sure that you go through proper processes of RFQ and getting competitive quotes and making sure that everybody's kind of there's some level of competition for your business. Evolving the RFQ. So this is something that I like to do. And what I mean by evolving the RFQ is you start, perhaps you don't really even have a strong history in writing a request for quote or a product requirement document. So one kind of cheat code that I like to do is you start with a template of what you think you want to do, but then as you go through and have it critiqued or questioned by your vendors, they help you to evolve thing and they ask usually very clever questions or things that you might have overlooked. So this is how a method of going through the coding process with different vendors, you can evolve your product requirement documents, RFQ, to make it more polished. Um, and then business matching. This is a critical thing. I'm quite the broken record on this one, but making sure that your business volumes and expectations and costings and these kind of things are matching to your vendors. If the scale of that factory's expectations is far beyond what you could ever push through in your distribution of a product, it's not going to go well. You might start very nicely with a few good months of a honeymoon, and then as soon as they realize that you're only going to perhaps ship 30,000 pieces a year when you thought a couple 100,000, you can really watch that relationship evaporate very quickly. So be careful on that. So that all reverts back to your plan. And the cultural bridge. So we're going to talk a bit about that as well. I'll give you some examples of all these different points coming up. It's not impossible. People are people, but just be aware of some certain things that you might not know when dealing with overseas vendors. And also intelligent sourcing. That revolves around knowing where you can squeeze and where you can't squeeze, and where to invest your energy on looking for something and how critical it is to your component. So that would be finding the right key component that's perhaps a cutting edge technology versus arguing about generic components or commodity components like capacitors or resistors. So that kind of also known as perhaps a joint development model, but we'll get into that in a bit. So
Yeah.
sourcing with plan. A product requirement document. This is kind of a critical thing. It's very important to do, and it's kind of a living, breathing document that you continually want to keep updating. And so it can start with a sketch on a napkin. Company like Flextronics actually have I think their company slogan is from sketch to scale. So that kind of talks about they want to be your partner to take your sketch, convert it into a PRD for you, and take you all the way through the process. You might want to have detailed schematics. So then you might want to be hiring your own design engineers and all that thing. So you can have very complex and very thorough PRD, or you might be somewhere in between, or between a sketch and a thorough PRD.
I have a
So
question, Dave, and question. So in this case, you've got someone who has an idea or a product. What if there's someone who simply wants to try to capture a market and they think that they have a product, they want to develop a product that competes or takes over part of a market segment. You know, if there's a well-known brand or a regionally known brand for a product that's in audio, maybe it's loudspeakers, maybe it's a system of loudspeakers, and they just say, I want to be that. Have you run into them before and then realize that they don't have a plan and you can help them bring that plan together other than we want to be like them? And then I think all of that kind of talks to this. They may not even have a sketch. They have a target. Is that
yeah, and that's actually that's a good point, Roger, because that's a common thing is benchmarking. Where do you see your product fitting into in like a SWOT analysis or some of these
yeah,
classic metrics is we want to be like a lower cost Sonos. Okay, so what does that take? Do you talk to Steve at LinkPlay, or what do you do to make that happen? So there's kind of different things, but that's a very good point is perhaps giving people who are helping you develop some references on where you want to be in terms of competitive products. So
and I think
benchmark.
yeah, and I think that that benchmark is somewhat goes to each of these points probably because if you don't have a bit plan, then you're going to go off in all different directions, and you may not even know how to scale, find the right scale for the manufacturing. I mean,
Yeah, I
say,
think that the plan, Roger, is really the most critical item. And
yeah,
all those variables that Dave laid out, I think, are very, very important. But if you don't have a plan, and that's one thing I know Dave does very well, is ensure that people do have that plan to be successful.
yeah.
Mhm.
And I think that has to come before engineering, honestly. I mean, otherwise you're putting
Yeah,
engineers through, useless activity and where you're
yeah,
spending too
absolutely.
much and
Yeah.
you end up overspending or under specifying. So yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry, Dave, go right ahead. Appreciate it.
No, it's all good stuff. And yes, of course, ultimately the business plan, because somebody's gonna have to fund this, and so their money deserves like a timeline and volumes and a budget, so we can at least predict some of these things for matching, and all the criteria I previously pointed out all blends back into both the product requirement document and your overall business plan. Um, so sourcing with your team. So primary and secondary resources. So for your engineering resources in developing a product, so you have all these different aspects of an acoustic audio product, and different engineering specialties within that. So perhaps you are one of these, and then you need to recognize where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, and just make sure that you're going to fill in those gaps, and make sure that you can have those resources as you move through the project. And those can be, again, back and forth. Those can be sometimes on the vendor side or sometimes on your side. So those can vary. Um, knowing your logistics, like knowing how you're going to get your product to market, is something that's, especially for me, after spending the bulk of my early career deploying embedded solutions into other products with factories. I never even thought about logistics. But then once you start helping people find products, then you realize, oh, geez, how are we going to get that out of China, or how are we going to get that out of the Philippines, and what are the benefits of those different things? And do you have somebody in Long Beach or Hamburg or wherever in the world to help bring that into your country or to your end market? So um usually the first time you go through that, it's a real headache, but as you go through these things, it all becomes learned knowledge. But perhaps at first you might want to get some advice on all these things. um so yeah, again, and like I said, with the engineering, this relates to this last point here, is this local team. Do you have your own team on site? Do you have contractors working remotely or on site, or is everything within your supplier? So again, we're going back and forth with this blend of what resources you have, and how do you utilize them. Um, let's just keep going here. One thing that's also important is you got to go there. Trying to phone it in just doesn't work. I just had a great example of this the other day, where somebody's looking for some hearing test headphone drivers, and they said, "Hey, we found this vendor on the internet in Guangzhou." And so they passed it over to me, and I didn't even end up having to go there. They just told me very quickly that they're not the manufacturer, they're just a reseller. So that's a little bit of a unique scenario, but that kind of thing happens all the time. A lot of people are just playing middleman. And hey, that might work for you if they do add other values that you're missing out on, such as logistics or packaging or something like this. But it might not be what you need. So going there and finding out exactly what you're dealing with is very important. And also developing these relationships, because when you place your first order and all the cash flow is nice, things are great, but perhaps you might run into some hurdles in the future, and you need to have some kind of relationship with people that you might be able to get a little bit of help here and there to keep your business running. So that's important to see them. And also, like, further to finding out if they actually build the product that they're selling you, there's all kinds of clues on the floors of the factories. Like, I love this, like seeing the empty boxes of where they're getting their parts from. It's like for me, it's a little detective game. It's like, oh, okay, they're getting those speaker drivers from those guys. Or, oh, you see on Sunday I was at a factory in Zhongshan, and there's like, oh, okay, you guys built some speaker headphones, headphone speaker drivers for me. Then I get to walk through their floor and I see, oh, they're building module boxes for TVs. That's their core business. Oh, so that's all kind of just getting in there and finding out what they're doing. And so a little bit of that might be these guys aren't even building speakers in their production line.
Mhm.
So
Wow.
just there's so much to find by just going there. I mean, it's so much better. And this kind of like this point's a little bit abstract, but it's extremely rare to find full vertical integration in 2024. So sometimes you might get there and you find out that they're getting their parts from someone else. Like I said about the hearing test headphone. Okay. Well, maybe they're just doing a final assembly of a with a headband or something like that. But just kind of figuring out the map of it is, and it might not matter to you if they're getting some parts from someone else. And just know what you're getting. So everybody's kind of doing that as well. Like even the big factories like Tiffany, they won't build everything themselves. I can't remember exactly how the relationship went, but when the Beats pill product was built, I believe that the Beats team had designated the drivers from GGC, and then Tiffany got to be the assembly factory. Now, normally you'd think they're complete competitors, but in a lot of cases, if the brand likes and they dig in and they get that subcomponent from somebody, they'll kind of legislate it into their product with another vendor who is normally a competitor. So everybody's kind of doing mix and match. There's a lot of business back and forth between factories that you wouldn't expect. So yeah, so this is just that story about they're not doing everything in-house, and so don't expect that.
Dave,
Um,
but
yeah,
shouldn't there be a difference between when you're identifying your potential suppliers, between what is an original design manufacturer, so an ODM, and an OEM? Would you think that it's easy to find that differentiation? Which companies do actually do their design and are able to support your project from the design stage, and which ones are purely assemblers or specialized manufacturers?
yeah. I usually find at a lot of the trade shows in Asia, you find a lot of these ODM vendors, which are people that will design your complete, but it's usually they're just got off the shelf products. That's tends to be the nature of an ODM, in my opinion. There are people like Flextronics, which, like I said, sketch to scale, which will design everything for you. Uh, that's that's a little rare, to be honest, because usually, like, I'll find design houses that will do industrial design or different aspects of it, and then it migrates to one of that design house's preferred partners. To find a factory that does everything from sketch to scale is very rare, um, in my estimation. So I think I'm getting repetitive a bit on this, but yeah, just making sure you know what they're building in-house and out and outsourced.
Yeah.
Um, so Fujicon's a good example. Like they build a tremendous amount of headphone drivers, but this I always like this vendor Union, so there's YY for short. They at one point they told me they were building 5 million speaker diaphragms a day,
Yeah.
and I hadn't really got into headphone speakers much until, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. But once I found out this name, literally everywhere you go, everybody knows YY. So like they're just like the de facto source for micro speaker diaphragms. So but that's just an example of like not everything is always built in-house again.
Yeah, I think the corollary to that is that there's a lot of factories that believe they have more capability than they actually do. They might think, well, I've got a loudspeaker manufacturing plant, but one maybe doesn't have the quality standards or the quality control that it needs to get to a certain level of OEM type quality, or they don't realize that what they're doing is doesn't meet their own goals, and they think that they can kind of take on more than they need. So there's a little bit of assessment that has to go on, and a, a self-check of themselves to see, to see how arrogant their thoughts might be in terms of their capability. So,
Well, yeah, and if that's again, Roger, if that's a critical part of your product,
yeah,
you want to dig in on it.
yeah.
Uh,
And I think this is good too, because if you come, a lot of us get involved with projects with, either someone who wants to be an OEM or an ODM or is going to be using them, but going to see if they believe they have the manufacturing, going to see it is probably the most critical thing you can do, because they may not even begin to understand the business they're about to get into. And I think that meets up later with your comment about business, uh, putting the scale of manufacturing together with what you're trying to build. So, yeah.
And Roger, one of the other, you could also think of this as the opposite approach, where the brands pigeonhole factories into
Yeah.
saying they're only really good at this.
Yeah.
And the factories, a lot of them do have, more capabilities or want to expand their capabilities. But the brands say, oh no, we've got you in this pigeonhole. This is what you're really, really good at. It's your core competency, and we don't want to take the risk of going outside that core competency. So, it's a balancing act. And I know the factories, as they evolve, because as you know, I worked at Symphony, and going back to Dave's story, their Peerless line of transducers are arguably, some of the best in the world, but yet they were buying drivers from GGEC, which
Mhm.
GGEC makes wonderful drivers. So again, it's a balancing act, and you have to, look at it in a bunch of multiple ways.
Yeah, I think guys like Dave are ideal for figuring out
Yeah.
where that really is. The other question I think is just kind of off the subject here, since this is supply chain, but intellectual property rights that get
Mhm.
shared sometimes. I mean, I think it's a lot of that is difficult to understand. And I think that's also partially why pigeonholes are
Yeah.
enforced, because you don't want that IP to leak out into, well, or not quickly, because you usually have a window of when you're going to be, at the top of what you're selling, and then that window closes, and then everybody has your IP. But I think that's part of it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, and depending on the company, I mean, you know, working with Amazon, for example, we did a product and I worked on it for 2 years and I didn't see any of it until it was released. So some
Uh,
people are a lot more confidential than others, and it just yeah. So and I wouldn't, depending on the scale of your company, I wouldn't get too worked up about the IP at first. Um, the reason for that is like it's I don't know, it's pretty rare that somebody has something dramatically unique anyways, not to
yeah.
be dismissive, but
Yeah.
you know, the people who are very secretive are usually these mobile phone type guys.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah,
Okay.
let's kind of keep going
Keep on
here.
going. Yeah.
This was one example that this reference might be a little dated, but I did visit Behringer back a few years ago, and these guys were nuts. They were even pulping their own paper for their cones. So they were just doing the very base materials processing, which was quite unique. Like they were doing everything in one facility. But I don't know if that still exists to this day because they were bought by this World Music or Music Tribe. So it might have changed a bit, but I just wanted to point out that a company like this, it was rare to find something completely vertically integrated. So, um, so yeah, this kind of important. You can't lose sight of the basics of business. It's very common that to people visiting China or Vietnam or whatever, that the vendors are super friendly and they'll take you for lunches and dinners, and it's they're trying to make friends and trying to get to know you. But don't get distracted like that. Make sure that you're still going to see other vendors and getting 3 quotes for any project minimum. And it all the dovetails back to being polishing your business plan and your product requirement document. So don't become complacent on this. Like kind of it almost dovetails into what you guys said earlier about this factory's good at this and we're going to do this at this factory all the time. You should still be checking with other vendors to see perhaps they've progressed and they're able to deliver for you. So don't become complacent in that, even as you move on to projects 2, 3, and 4. One thing that Foxconn was always doing to kind of avoid like good buddy business and pricing was to cycle their GMs from each Foxconn facilities. So they'd get 2 years to go in and make all the guanxi, which is guanxi is the Chinese word for business relationship. And then they would get cycled into a new location. So as your company grows, you might want to be careful of like if you have a sourcing consultant or a quality inspection consultant, uh, be wary of that because they are making relationships and they're getting preyed on by your vendor customers to qualify things that maybe they shouldn't be. So don't be afraid to cycle some of these relationships that you make uh, to make sure that you're still getting everything checked out properly. So yeah, it just forces everything to renegotiate and double check all your pricing and everything. And of course, I like this one. There's no such thing as stupid questions, just stupid people. But back to don't lose sight. Just as you're going through this RFQ process, there's all kinds of things that you can learn from engineers and product development people, and they'll ask all the questions like certification questions, technical questions. And every time you're going through this process and people are asking you questions about your plan, make sure you're taking notes, and then it just helps you polish your RFQ into a better document that really defines exactly what you're going to do. I really like that for like early stage processing, so I highly recommend that. Sometimes like I said, they're redundant or annoying, but just keep going through it, and the more vendors you ask, the more different questions, and you'll learn things that you just might not have paid attention to. All right. So this was an example of a RF accessory, so a wireless accessory for the custom install market. This client I had wanted to develop, and so we tendered it out to 5 different vendor candidates. And each of those candidates offered a different solution. Not everybody said, talk to Steve Willenberg. They said, talk to this guy, talk to that guy. So there's a lot of different choices in both hardware and software. And so it was like, okay, so how do all these things work and what's different about each RF solution? So then it allowed the client to kind of just define better what they want and learn about what the options are to consider, maybe not on this product, but perhaps oh, those are features I'd like to have in the future. So if I choose this solution now, how can I expand my ecosystem going forward? Yeah. So yeah, just always harping on this business basics. So in sales, you always want to set the expectations accurately that this car is going to be good for this many thousand miles. And then the customers can never, like, if you oversell them, they're always going to be disappointed. So just make sure that the expectations are set accurately, but that also refers to your vendors. Make sure that if you're selling into Europe, it's usually, most like home theater systems or something in Europe is maybe a 30 to 50,000 units a year. That's a great product for Europe. So don't think that you're going to roll in there and sell a couple 100,000 units on project number one. It's just not realistic. So just making sure that you're sharing that with your vendors accurately so that they don't get disappointed is important. Um, Further to those volume expectations and the actual churn of the business expectation, understanding their engineering skills as well, and yours. And so depending on your product, where are their expertise? So again, back to the point of people kind of designate certain factories as being good at certain things. So There's certain factories like Xylox that are very famous for doing sound bars, but they're also very famous for wanting high volumes. And so most of the Xylox, GGC, Tiffany, these kind of guys, they're going to have really quite large volume expectations for you to work with them. So maybe you have to think about a little bit lower tier. And so where does that fit in that? And so if you wanted a sound bar and you need engineering resources, perhaps as you go down in tier, they might not have all the skills that you need. So then you might have to hire a contractor or two to help walk you through the process. And that's like guys like Roger are around to help you with that. So because most of us are going to start not at Tiffany and GGC, let me promise you that much.
Mm.
Um, so this is all kind of repetitive now about where you're going to be for numbers. And it's nice to have clear definitions of what you're expecting and put that in your product requirement document that you're going to handle, maybe software on some kind of function and you've hired a consultant to do that. And where does that handover happen? Are you going to have your firmware loaded onto a chip independently? I had a question about that recently. Somebody making a gaming controller accessory for mobile phones, and they had some specialized firmware, and they wanted to buy the chips and have it loaded at a third-party factory so that their final assembly factory didn't have access to that code. So that was kind of defining responsibilities that we're going to do the code. We're going to supply you with a chip that has the code on it, and it's just going to be a part number that you order from this firmware loading facility. So all these kind of things. Communication. How are you going to communicate? It's quite common that something like a Zoom call or whatever will not work at certain regions in Asia. So your video meeting resources and these kind of things might not have access. There's a few even project management tools that are blocked in China as well. So people won't have access to see when you're trying to share files back and forth, stuff like this. So you'll learn very quickly on how to get your stuff to them, and it might be on platforms that you've never used before. And yeah, do you get along with them? Of course, that's kind of an obvious thing, but it's always nice if you can work with people you like. Cultural bridge. So having people local to check on your factory, this is kind of an interesting story. But yeah, so do you have a local engineering team or do you have a single sourcing auditor that's a local person that's going to check on them? So just understanding what you're going to have. And real-time continuous communication. Typically, this is always WeChat communication, no matter if you're dealing with a tiny little factory or today I was at Logitech and literally everybody here at Logitech in Taiwan was adding me to WeChat. So it's a global communication thing, and pretty much you got to get used to it if you're going to work in production manufacturing is good old WeChat. Another reason for WeChat, a lot of people don't realize, is people can bring their mobile phone into the production floor, but they can't necessarily bring a computer or a USB
Mm.
with a USB drive in it into the production floor. So that's a little bit of the reason why WeChat is so popular in beyond just that it's actually a really cool tool for doing pretty much anything in China. But it's one of the reasons I noticed is people can bring their phone into the production, so you always have access to them wherever they are in the facility. And yeah, like still to this day, I see people trying to share Google Docs to me. And yeah, okay, I'm in Hong Kong, so I can get access to that. But then other people I'm dealing with, I can't share it to them. So then end up being a liaise where I'm sending it via some other medium for them. So just try to avoid using Google Docs for your document hosting. Focus on the clarity of language and terminology. This is an example where I learned something from Lenovo, so I didn't quite understand. This was kind of a new terminology, but it was like voice print. And so I thought, oh, sounds like a hybrid of fingerprint, which it actually is, but I just thought they were making something up at Lenovo, but it's actually kind of a vernacular for voice ID when you're talking into a device and it recognizes your voice. That's kind of what they're calling voice print now. At least Lenovo team is. Whether that becomes the ubiquitous term. I don't know, but at one point I just thought they were making something up, but no, I didn't understand the jargon yet. So yeah, this was voice biometrics. An example of learning from experience was, so sometimes if depending on the person's English skills, they might just say yes,
Mhm.
and it might just be yes, we hear you talking. And so just make sure and don't be afraid to repeat yourself and find other ways to say it to make sure that your message is coming across clearly. This might sound like we're going into very elementary kind of messaging and how to deal with things, but it is very important in person to make sure that you're getting the message across. And one kind of, I guess, something I don't like about habits of some of the factories is they tend not to turn on their webcams when they're doing a video call with you. I would try to encourage them to do that because there's a lot in their facial
Yeah.
recognition where they're looking at their colleague when you ask a question that you can just go, oh, okay, maybe he didn't understand it. So maybe I just need to just keep on working that point to make sure we're getting the message across. So kind of communication basics. This could apply to whether you're building sneakers or speakers, but at any rate, I think it's an important thing to convey to people. Yeah, so the small the smaller vendors as well. The person at the small vendors typically the marketing people that you would be dealing with is somebody who studied English in university and they have no idea and they own zero audio products. So you have to be aware of that you're gonna be very patient in communication because making sure that the message gets translated to that engineer. So that could be a good example when you want to hire somebody locally to help you with communication on an engineering level. So that's something to watch out for in the cultural bridge. This is kind of more like perhaps touching a bit on IP related issues, but don't expect their rules and laws to match yours. So, if we got to deal with European people, Joe, I'm picking on you. It's You got to remember that the common law from the US doesn't apply necessarily in Europe. They use a civil code. Now you go into China, China also uses a civil code, which means that all their laws are written down and prescribed. You don't have verbal arguments or these kind of precedent-based rulings. So that's a little different. So this was an example of just where somebody was setting themselves up for failure. So there's a specialty firm out of Dallas that provides AV systems to private jets. Sounds kind of flash. You'd think that they'd have a budget. Anyways, they needed a $125,000 worth of OLED displays, 27-inch OLED displays for their private jets. But they demanded a warranty from a I think it was from TCL. But they wouldn't spend $250 to send somebody who's an expert in display panels to go and inspect the goods. Now this is it's audio video, but we'll just use this as an example. It seems quite foolish to me to not spend that money just to send somebody for a half day to go make sure that these parts are good, because in the long run, if you run into problem, international legal cases will cost you well over $125,000. So I can introduce you to a lawyer in Hong Kong if you need one, but he's 800 US dollars an hour, and you really don't want to go there. So I recommend spend the money up front on certain little things to make sure you're protecting your interests. Another example is somebody that a second tier mobile phone brand, and they didn't get their phones from their vendor, so they were buying phones. And the GM of the foreign company, who was actually based in Shenzhen, was told by the Chinese lawyer, do not appear in court in this breach of contract dispute, because the courts are heavily favored for locals in China. So just that's the way it is. And then back to my civil code example. intelligent sourcing. So this is a reasonable person test. So just kind of a nice little segue in the legal vein here. Knowing what parts you can cost down. So as you're building your product, like you'll have some key components. I always like to use the word the RF or wireless components, because then we can pick on Steve Willenberg, but I digress. It's really like that's kind of the critical component nowadays, is like your wireless communication. You can't afford to have dropouts. You want to have all these features happening over the air. That's something that you don't want to mess around with and have a bad performance just by trying to drive the cost out and getting something much cheaper. There's other things that you might be able to focus on, like with resistors or some kind of generic components. And that's perhaps where you can rely on your manufacturing partner to say, okay, all these parts, you let it open. Okay, we don't have to use this Western made microcontroller. We can, if you have a part you recommend that you think is equally good and you've used, let's look at that. So that's kind of gets into design for availability, and or sometimes kind of a joint development model. So yeah, this back to the critical components. Sometimes for large organizations, we do find that there's a disconnect from purchasing and engineering. So like I always remember Philips doing sound bars for Philips, and they're just told we need to cost down 10%. So purchasing just goes, every part on this bill of materials, we got to take 10% off. But sometimes if it's a critical component, there's nothing to give away. So I think it just a little bit more intelligence in your sourcing that can apply to you as a small company trying to get started is where can you focus your energy? So yeah, joint development model. We talked about that earlier today. So just yeah, focusing on the different classes of components.
Yeah, I think the design for availability falls into the product planning, the product management aspect of what we talked about earlier, is that you need to know that as well. I mean, when you're making that plan, you need to make sure that you're building with parts that you could actually buy somewhere on a regular basis, and they're not going to come scarce. I think that's
Yeah.
very intelligent. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that really gets noticed in Bluetooth development.
Yes.
So you want to use Qualcomm because Bose uses it. Well, good luck getting support if you're only trying to build 15 or 20,000 products a year.
Exactly.
It's virtually impossible unless you find a design house and that can help you customize your code. Unless you're just doing generic products that look like or behave like everyone else's. So
No, no, it's good. Thank you, Dave. That
yeah.
was a great overview. And of course, you can follow Dave there. Dave is also, you're the host of your THD podcast. You can like him as well there and go and check him out,
Yeah.
as well as come back and see us here at the Audio Product Development Alliance. I mean, we will talk not only about supply chain, but design, measurement, test, simulation, automotive applications, headphones, earphones, the wireless technology that and I think we'll also spend some time on industry standards and try to make those as interesting as possible. But I think that's pretty much what we try to do again at the APDA. Does anyone else have a question here as we wrap up? I think that was a great overview of the product, the lessons learned in supply and how to plan for your product development.
Thanks.
All
Yeah,
right.
thank you, Dave. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, everyone who was able to attend, and also thank you to Spencer, who has been producing this behind the scenes. And don't forget to like us, the Audio Product Development Alliance, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. This will be there up on the video channel. And
Share,
I hope.
comment, explain.
Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you again soon. And have a good. Thanks. Bye now.
All right.
Thank you,
Thanks for
David.
tuning in, everybody. Bye-bye.